Hey, welcome to this afternoon's live webinar with me, George Anderson, and human performance expert from Optimal Life, Simon Shepard. How you doing today, Simon?
Not too bad. It's a bit muggy where I am at the moment. It's not the most glamorous background, but
yeah, you look like you're stuck in a cupboard somewhere. Where are you?
Well, I'm in a cupboard in Lord's Cricket Ground. So this is sort of my second home, where I've sort of spent quite a lot of my life trying to look after those great athletes that our cricketers are. Maybe not so great when I started back in the early 90s, but things have improved a bit since then.
So we'll come with a bit of background here, a bit of context for people. I mean, today we're going to be talking about heart rate variability, which sounds like it's going to be the same thing as just heart rate and how we use heart rate to monitor training intensities, but it's completely different. So we'll get stuck into that in just a moment. But you're here at Lord's, broadcasting live from Lord's Cricket Ground, a skiing place. What's your connection with Lord's?
Well, I'm a physiotherapist by background, so I started off in 1991 looking after players, and in those days there was myself and no one else, and it's been interesting seeing how sports science has developed over the last 25 years or so, and now the international team would probably have more support team in the dressing room than actual players. So there are all sorts of people around these days, but so when I started off it was a lonely existence, and now I'm very old for this job now, so I just look after all the other physios and osteopaths and sports scientists and massage therapists that look after things at Lord's and with Middlesex Cricket Club.
Yeah, I bet you've got a few stories to tell. That's what
maybe.
Back in the 90s, I'm sure. But no, we are here today to talk about heart rate variability, and I'm sure that there's this is something that you've used in the world of high-end sport, but it's also something that gets used from conversations we've had over the last year or so in kind of everyday life, in performance, human performance, in business, in life, obviously in sport and training as well, not just cricket, but with running or any kind of exercise. Give me kind of a snapshot. What is HRV, for example?
Well, I'm a picture person, so I'm going to share my screen and just show some pictures if that's all right, because that helps me. Let's make sure we can get this to. This is where fingers crossed and hearts and mouths and make sure tech works. How about that? Are we looking good?
I can see it. Yep, perfect. Brilliant.
Good. Okay. So I first really got into heart rate variability about 10 years ago when I stumbled across a company in Finland called First Beat, and I liked what it did because it mimics something called the autonomic nervous system. So I thought, just to start off, let's have a little look at what is heart variability and how is it measured. In simple terms, heart rate variability is a measurement between the 2 points that are marked off on that diagram. That's an ECG trace, it's a PQRST complex, and the two highest points are called your R spike. So this is called R to R interval, and we measure that in milliseconds. And why this is useful is it helps us mirror the autonomic nervous system, that nervous system that controls all the things we don't think about, such as our breathing and our sweating and our digestion and the way our heart beats and our blood pressure, etc., etc. And very simple terms, we have two branches in our autonomic system. We have a sympathetic branch, which becomes active when we're loaded or anxious or excited or euphoric, or maybe even struggling with fatigue. And we have a parasympathetic branch that becomes active when we're trying to restore and recover. And the sympathetic branch results in the release of hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol, and our blood pressure tends to rise. But what happens to the pattern of your heart rate or heart rate variance is it becomes very metronomic. So we can have a heart rate of 60 and it would be literally 1 beat a second, just like a banging drum. Boom, 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 boom. The parasympathetic branch, however, the pattern of the heart rate changes. So we could still have a heart rate of 60, but that heart might beat quickly for 5 or 10 seconds, then slowly for 5 or 10 seconds, quickly for 5 or 10, then slowly. So we have two identical heart rates, but two totally different patterns. And by measuring this, it allows us to understand and gives us a bit of a mirror into what's going on with regards to stress hormones and other physiological parameters in the body. And just to put it simply, I know a lot of your audience is quite into training. The original science behind this from the Finnish company looked at overtraining in endurance athletes. And this looks a complicated graph, but let me explain this, and hopefully it won't be so. So this is looking at just a very, very simple 5-minute trace. It looks at the changes in heart rate variability in an athlete. This is the same athlete, top and below. And I think you can see two totally different traces. The trace at the top shows that it's zigzagging all over the place. And whilst there's an average heart rate of 48 in that person, shown on the numbers on the right-hand side, there is significant heart rate variability, indicating that there's good recovery and potentially health. This athlete was deliberately overtrained, deliberately fatigued over a 2-month period. You can see the trace has changed. You can see the heart rate has actually dropped a fraction, the resting heart rate. But the heart rate variability has changed enormously, much more indicative of overload and minimal recovery responses. So that top graph shows us a sort of typical trace of someone in parasympathetic dominance. The bottom graph shows us someone in sympathetic dominance.
So this is just to cut in there for my clarity. This is really interesting because we've always been told that it's about your resting heart rate. You know, the lower that goes, the more recovered you are, and the fitter and stronger that muscular pump is becoming, and efficiency and so on. So what you're saying here is that actually it's not just the number of beats per minute, but it's how those beats per minute are happening, and that can give us an insight into which arm of the autonomic system, nervous system we're in, whether we're recovered or whether we're under that extra load, that stress that you talk about there.
Yeah, exactly right, George. So it's not just the number, it's the architecture of the number. It's how that number is put together.
Yeah, well, there's kind of two ways, I guess, with this, two ways of looking at this, because you've got you know that this athlete has been overtrained. That was a deliberate thing. You trained them hard for 2 months or 8 weeks, and then you tested them again, and you were able to see that, oh, look, when we overtrain somebody, this is what their heart rate data looks like. Does it work the other way around? And can you track somebody's heart rate variability and have that give some insight into whether or not they need to rest more?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are an increasing number of devices on the market that will give us a snapshot of heart rate variability. The story doesn't end just with the snapshot, but certainly it's becoming more available to a whole host of different population groups. So if I think of the sort of devices that I use to measure, there's the traditional heart rate belts, as long as they do collect data at a specific, with greater sensitivity. There are some biofeedback tools. So the one on the left there is a device called an M-Wave that people can plug themselves into and just try and coach themselves to calm down and relax and get a degree of coherence and heart rate variability. More and more devices are using optical sensors to pick up pulses in the wrist, and some will be more accurate than others. I'm not sure we've really got there to quite get the sensitivity that we need to look at some of the stuff that we look at. We can look at a formal ECG, and that's the device we use for longer term measurements. It's called a bodyguard device. And so we will use a combination of probably belts and the device on the right to collect data, but it has to be collected at probably greater than 200 hertz to make sense of it with the algorithms that we use.
So what does a standard heart rate belt rate?
The one at the top there would be around about 200 hertz. It collects both heart rate and heart rate variability.
Okay.
Not all of them will collect heart rate variability.
So we may have a belt already, a heart rate belt. Some of the better ones, perhaps. That will
absolutely. And a lot of the wearable devices, some of the Sunto, some of the Polar devices, will use some of the algorithms that we're going to talk about in a moment with embedded into their technology to give numbers relating to, for example, training effect, or more recently, Firstbeat have integrated a quick recovery score and a recovery index into 1 or 2 devices.
Wow. Just to kind of come slightly off track, you mentioned, was it the M-Wave, that thing on the left-hand side of the screen? You said that people can use that to track their heart rate, but they can coach themselves to kind of calm down and bring themselves back into the parasympathetic system. How would somebody do that? I mean, is it just by looking at it and then trying to drop your heart rate like James?
Yeah, it tends to, heart rate variability is very closely linked to on-off respiratory dynamics. So it's often about getting your breathing in a controlled, coherent pattern, and then your heart follows. And the device gives you biofeedback so you can see. So for example, the device on the right here, the Bodyguard, we would use for a diagnostic purpose and a real understanding of someone. This sort of device on the left, the M-Wave, is very much more of a coaching device and something you deliberately interact with.
I see. Yeah, no, I used to have a device called it was called a Spire. I don't know if you've ever come across that. It's like a little device that goes on your belt on the inside, and it just tells you anytime you stop breathing.
Right.
You're holding your breath, you're very tense, then it just gives you a little buzz, like a pulse or something, and it just like, oh, right, okay. So again, it gives you that feedback, and I found it very useful to use for a couple of months to remind me, and then I knew that what I had to do was just to take a couple of deep breaths to discharge any of that kind of energy that was in the system. And I guess that M-Wave thing does the same. It shows you, or similarly, shows you where you are, and then allows you to use your breathing and other systems to just calm things down slightly.
Yeah, and a really useful, deliberate coaching mechanism. Really useful.
So tell me more about how this is used in training, because obviously this is information. It's great to have information, but unless you do something useful with that data, then it's just more stuff what we know. So how is it being used at the moment in kind of the world of exercise?
Well, let's sort of take you through a little bit of how it's used in terms of exercise and fitness. And I'm just going to use some personal examples here and personal approach. So if I'm working with an athlete or a sports person or just a weekend warrior who's keen to do their best, I'm really talking about two things. I'm talking about the loads that go through their system, and I'm also talking about recovery. How do we actually balance things out? And there'll be certain times of the year where we might want to amplify the load. For example, if we're looking to try and get a super compensation effect pre-season, we probably want to see significant load, and we might not want to see as much recovery. If we're coming up to a really important event, then I'm probably looking to maximize the recovery and reduce the load. So again, collecting data and having an approach has got to fit in with what's the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve with this person at this moment. And I think that's sometimes something that people forget. Elite athletes rarely train in the same way for 52 weeks a year. And yet, working with the amateurs, I often find, I do 3 5K runs a week, or I knock out 50 kilometers a week, whatever it is. And you say, well, when do you change that? No, I don't. And I'm not sure that's the best approach if one's trying to get an adaptive response through the body.
Yeah, you said that to me in an email when we were having a bit of an exchange about this a few weeks ago. We were kind of trying to, work out the best approach and what information to share, how it would be useful. And I kind of talked about how, how do you use this to help people achieve their goals? And your response was very kind of very direct. It's like, well, it depends on what the goal is. And you just mentioned something there which was interesting, that actually sometimes the goal is to overload. That is the purpose of the training phase that you're in. As a personal trainer back in the day, when I'd write out training programs, there would always be periodized programs. You'd go through a phase that would build up over 4 or 5 weeks, that would get progressively more intense or higher volume. But then you'd have this recovery week. You'd go back in again, you'd build on what you'd done previously, but with a slightly different focus. So again, what you're saying here is that actually it depends on how you use this data and how you interpret the data. Depends on what the goal of that particular part of your training cycle really is. And so does that mean that if somebody is just, as you said, a weekend warrior, they're going out maybe just 2-3 times a week, would like to see some improvements, but they're not like super dedicated, super committed, can this information still be useful to somebody like that? Or is it skewed more towards somebody who's training 5-6 times a week, is really committed to the process and to smashing PBs every season, and has that periodized approach?
Well, I think it's useful in both fronts. And maybe if we look at some of the data from the sporting world, and then maybe look at some of the data from the sort of what I call the more world of work and world of business, I always sort of set the challenge, how can we be a bit better a bit more often in whatever we want to do in life? And if that's about exercise, how can we be a bit better at that? I might then break it down, well, why do you want to exercise? And some people it will be, I'm going to really go for PBs every other week or whatever else. Some people is, I want to exercise just to switch my mind off and be happy. Well, if that's your goal, that's fantastic. Let's make sure we're getting the right recipe to allow you to achieve that. it will still be a balancing act between load and recovery.
Yeah.
But the recovery mechanisms and the load might be slightly different.
Okay. So you mentioned there about kind of using this in the world of work as well. So, you know, we're talking about kind of the corporate athlete, somebody who's a high performer, but in a slightly different way. And I mean, I go into companies and I talk about the importance of well-being and looking after nutrition and recovery and so on, and how that can impact on your productivity, your ability to concentrate and do work efficiently. Is this something that we can actually get some data from and use that to say, you might be feeling okay, but actually right now you're on the fast track to overload and burnout?
Absolutely. And you might also get the reciprocal message, which is you feel stressed and overloaded, but physiologically you're doing fine. And often people walk out going, oh, I'm a bit better than I thought I was. You know, we are in this time where it's almost become the bragging rights to become stressed across the workplace. You know, your stress can't be as big as my stress. My stress has got to be the biggest around here. So sometimes it's the reciprocal message. But shall I just show a few examples first of all?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that'd be helpful.
So I thought there'd be a few examples from exercise first, just to start off, and then I'll show you some from the corporate. So this is actually just refereeing a rugby match, something that I do on a regular basis. This was the first match I ever refereed. A few years ago. Yeah, this is me. And you can see there's some blue lines there, which is my heart rate, and you can see between the hour sort of 2:20, the kickoff was at 3. I was warming up, and I was probably overdoing my warm up a little bit in terms of duration, but maybe not in terms of intensity. We kicked off at 3 o'clock, and you can see a red line suddenly going up, rocketing up. Well, that line signifies something called EPOC, which stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. In simple terms, that's how much oxygen do I need to put back into my body to take it to a position of homeostasis. I start running around, I start panting, I start sweating. How much oxygen needs to come back into me to actually bring me down to a position of homeostasis? The higher that red line is, the harder that exercise is becoming from a cardiovascular point of view. So whilst heart rate has gone up and has stayed upward, put a trend line through my heart rate, it's not so dramatic as the trend line through my EPOC. And I think what's also interesting is at 3:35, I made an absolute howler of a decision, which I knew I'd made as soon as I'd blown my whistle and given a penalty one way. And you can see how the red line suddenly increases. So EPOC
Sorry, Simon, just to kind of clarify that, when you say you made a howler of a decision, it wasn't that the decision was to sprint from one end of the pitch to the other. You made a decision and you thought, oh, damn it, shouldn't have made that decision, or that went the wrong way. And it was that kind of that inner stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And we've got a marker that looks at both sort of the internal mental stress as well as external stress.
Yeah, wow.
I just think that's an interesting example, because you can see a very dramatic increase in the shape of the graph, or change in the shape of the graph.
That's really interesting, because we often talk about the whole fight and flight response, and you know, you see an angry bear and you run away. That's what we would have done, historically as we've evolved. But now we don't have so many angry bears, but we have bills to open, we have stressful emails to respond to, and we hear about this whole fight flight response. But actually seeing it graphically like that, this is what happens in amongst the physiological side as well. So physically you're exercising, you can see it going up and down, and then boom, you have this stress, this mental stress, and how that compounds things. That's really interesting. That's fascinating. Anyway, as you were.
Here we go. Next example. This is two rugby games, again refereeing. You can see two totally different epochs. And I entitled this Carpet v Bog, because it shows the differences between the environment that we're running on, the ground we're running on. So the top one was on a beautiful carpet of a pitch. The bottom one was on a pitch that was very heavily waterlogged. The distance I covered in both of those matches, actually I covered less of a distance in the bottom one, but you can see it was much harder work for me.
Yeah.
So getting an appreciation of some of the environmental factors can be really powerful, and temperature, particularly the temperatures we've been experiencing recently. It certainly influences my desire to go out and knock out 5 or 6 Ks when I get home in the evening when it's boiling hot. And part of the reason is temperature is really demanding. It causes a much greater physiological response through our system. So whilst I may well do a 5-6 K in a similar sort of time, I come back feeling absolutely whacked because the environmental factors that have been going through me. So that then has got to influence my recovery strategies, or maybe even my preparation strategies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just to sort of summarize where we're going to go to next, sorry, they're a little bit small, these graphs, but these are two footballers, professional footballers playing in the same game. This was done years ago, but we measured them in a reserve team game, and you can see that the trends of the epoch line are very similar. We've got warm-up, we've got first half, half-time it comes down. Second half is often much lower. The game tends to be played at a slower pace, etc., etc. The epoch peaks were very similar, 214 on the left, 215 on the right. So the load was consistent, but when we looked at their recovery statuses the evening after the match, you can see totally different recoveries.
So what are we looking at here?
Where I think it takes the conversation on into the world of work and in the world of sport is traditionally we've looked an awful lot at load. How much demand are we putting through people? Well, exactly the same in these two people, but how well did they recover? And therefore, how resilient are they, or how prepared are they to work tomorrow?
Yeah, I was just going to say that does sound like we're coming into the territory of resilience, which a very simple equation being stress plus recovery equals resilience. You need that stress in order to build and get stronger mentally, but you can't do that without the right recovery strategies. That's a message I've always been very keen to deliver. So again, what we're seeing here is that you can actually datafy it. You can quantify what's actually happening here with not just the performance, but also the recovery.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's what we do in the workspace. So I hope that gives a bit of an insight on exercise, but in the world of work.
And this is where you spend a lot of your time now, isn't it? You know, you've obviously got the history with the the sporting side, but you spend a lot of your time going in, giving talks in workplaces, and also working with companies with certain members of their teams to actually analyze their data and give them individual kind of feedback on what their recovery strategies could be improved to be.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the data of fluffy stuff. So we'll go in and provide talks around the fluffy stuff, and then we'll provide a personalized and objective approach. And yeah, hopefully you get individuals to tweak their strategies around sort of resilience and performance. But the other thing we really try and do is open up conversations across teams so that they understand how they can look after each other and be more effective together from a physiological point of view. The process is similar. The device will be the bodyguard. The slight difference here from the world of sport is whilst people are wearing that, they keep an online diary. You see them here, a bit like an Outlook diary. So they'll keep an online diary through their mobile phone. And then we produce a report that matches the physiological response that you can see at the top in those sort of green, red and blue with their diary markers that are rather blurred that sit underneath and a whole load of other parameters. So we can produce a report that I always say pieces together the jigsaw. It looks at stress and recovery responses. The stress responses are in red, the recovery in green. Physical load is in blue. We'll look at percentages of recovery. We'll look at length of sleep, but I'm much more interested in the actual quality of a sleep that's going on. We will look at physical activity from a health promotion point of view. We can look at it in the same way as we look with the sports people by looking at epochs. We'll look at energy expenditure over a whole 24-hour period. I mean, it's incredible how little attention people pay to refueling strategies. And I say we'll always match it against the diary. And it's the story and the context that allows the data to become real.
Okay. So with that, would the person who you're studying at this point, would they wear that for like a day, 2 days, a week? How long do they wear it for you to give that? Yeah,
we typically ask people to wear it for between 3 and 5 days.
Okay.
And ideally with 1 day away from work, because it's quite interesting to see the differences between a life at work and life away from it. And it isn't always what people think.
Okay. When you've obviously analyzed the data in the way that you have done there as that example, what's the next step? How do you then, you said that you can go and kind of provide recovery strategies. Is it things like, you need to sleep more, or do you try to tie it back into things that they've already observed about themselves and say, well, when you felt like that, you can see here that your HRV was like this, or your recovery was down. Is that kind of how you work things with the interpretation of the data?
Yeah, we use the data to open up a conversation. So some people love data and the conversation's very heavily leans towards it. Other people are maybe much more into the solutions, with the data being a segue for that. So we will look at what we call KHPIs, key human performance indicators, and use those to initiate conversations around factors that will help either reinforce the data if it's good, or maybe change it if it's not so good. So there may well be strategies around sleep. There may well be strategies around switching your mind off. There may well be strategies around organization and preparation in the workplace, making sure that you're actually managing time effectively. Again, it's a fascinating observation of human nature, is when you ask people what's the most demanding thing in your day, I don't have enough time.
Yeah.
But that's one thing we can't change. The time will be constant. We haven't rethought how we're using our time. We might talk about physical activity. We have very clear links between healthy physical activity and good quality sleep and reduced stress levels. We might talk about mindset. We might talk a bit about nutrition. And one thing we really try and talk about is opening up the conversation about responsibility and relationship the person has with themselves.
How do you mean?
Again, it goes back to that. Well, why do you want to change anyway?
Okay. So does this generally come from the individual? I mean, if you were working with a company, a corporate, and they have say 1,000 employees, and they say, right, guys, you've all got access to this, we're going to make you do this, or do they tend to kind of self-select? Say, yeah, I'd be interested in doing that because they have something that they would like to improve, they want to work on, they're coming at it from a very kind of open-minded perspective?
Yeah, we tend to work with teams, to be honest. So we often find that this is a really useful tool to put into either a team building process or supporting a team that's going through transition and change. Some businesses actually have really bought into the human and humane side of performance. So let's actually not just say we're doing it, but work on it. So we would typically work with teams. We do work with a few individuals. But I know where our sweet spot is, and it tends to be with middle management, leadership, high performance programs, resilience programs.
Okay. Just kind of one other thing that popped into my mind a moment ago as well. You said when you were giving people their sort of strategies that they can then use to improve. I mean, you must be having a field day at the moment with the amount of data that people have just on strapped to their wrists with things like Garmin's and Suntos and so on. We seem to have really fallen in love with data anyway. And, if our watch tells us we have to do something, then we have to do it. So actually getting this, piggybacking on this general trend that people seem to love data and be able to see graphical representations. If you can see somebody's recovery improving, see their stress levels reducing, and you can show them that because they've done the things that you've suggested, I can imagine how much more buy-in you get to adherence, people actually doing those things that you suggest, which is often the biggest challenge, right? You can tell somebody, right, you need to do this, but unless they do it, then nothing's going to change. So when you can show somebody quantifiably, graphically, how things have shifted, how things have improved, that must make things so much easier for people to buy into the concepts and the ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always ask people to actually log the goals they're setting themselves after they've worn the monitor the first time. And then, funnily enough, the first question they ask when they wear it again is, you said you were going to do this last time. How successful have you been? And again, it just opens up another level of conversation around compliance, accurate goal setting, accurate goal reviewing. What were the barriers, all those sorts of things that challenge people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've got obviously you do this professionally. You've got this that you go into companies, but you also do this with individuals. I know you've got a special offer that you're going to open up to my guys, to my not here just here and on the wagon, my YouTube channel, my other subscribers, and so on. Obviously, quite limited. 100 people by the end of July, and then kind of go back to what it normally is. But before I kind of go into what that offer is and what you're suggesting, talk me through the process. How does it actually work? If somebody says, you know what, I want you to do that analysis with me. What's the first thing that happens along that process?
Sure. Well, the way we open it out to what I would call the consumer market, as opposed to groups within businesses, is they just register with us. I think in this case we're going to get them to register with you, and you'll then forward the details. We will get a monitor sent out to you. There'll be a film with instructions of how to wear and what yourself letting
one of those things that kind of attaches to the chest.
Yeah, it will be that thing there on the left.
Oh yeah.
We'll send the monitor out. We'll send the electrodes out. We'll send instructions out. We will, of course, send a GDPR compliance letter out and ask if you're consent.
Lots of data here.
Yes, all of these sorts of things, and a more traditional consent form, so you actually understand what we are doing and equally what we're not doing. So we're looking to provide an evaluation of your lifestyle. This is not so much a medical. This is not a traditional, what I call pathogenic medical. This is a process looking at lifestyle assessment.
Okay, so they've been sent the device. They've got all the information. They then strap themselves up and just go on their merry way for.
Yeah, they do. They'll get an email through which will give them a link that they'll be able to put their diary markers in. So when they're sleeping, and you can see in the little example I've got in the middle, I had a coffee with Tracy for an hour. So whatever you put into your diary will appear on your report.
Okay, and then. So we've got subscribers all over the place that you don't actually have to be physically with you in order for this to happen. The data is gathered by the device, transmitted somewhere centrally as well, and then the online diary that you're keeping. And then what happens at the end of that to gather all that information?
So the data's on the device. You then the person would send the data back, send the device back to us. We then upload it. We marry the diary with the physiological response. We produce a report. We email that report through to the person, and we will set up a coaching call. So we will do this telephonically.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the whole, if you're not near Lord's Cricket Ground or wherever your other bases are, that could be a bit of a deal breaker for a lot of people. But if it's still all done remotely, it's all done telephonically, and then at the end, presumably, you just send the device back to. Yeah,
the device would have come back to us beforehand, so we can produce a report before the coaching thing. So,
so you actually pull it off the device.
Yeah.
Directly. Okay, cool. I see. That makes sense. Now I know that when you do this, normally it's kind of around the £230 mark, including VAT. But the offer that you've got for us here in for my guys, I'm talking about kind of on the wagon where this is being broadcast live, but also my other YouTube channel, my subscribers, my emails, and so on, for just £165 for this. This is something that you're doing. Presumably doing quite a lot of these, and it's not just you. You've got a team of experts as well who are.
Yeah, we've got a team of people. So the people doing the feedback would come from our team. And the only small print I'm going to put in there is that the person needs to be UK based for where the monitor's going to. We can't do it at that price and send them to Timbuktu or wherever else. But
you can do it. It would need to be. It would be more expensive, obviously, to get it shipped.
It would be. We could do it, but we would need to have a conversation on price.
Yeah. Okay, so nobody's actually excluded, but that deal, £165. If you want to be in the mix there, if you want to be one of the first 100 people, or the offer ends as well at the end of July 2018. So let me know. You can either message me directly through any of my channels, or email me at george@bygeorgeanderson.com. And I'll get all those details up on the website as well. But it's been, even without that, it's been fascinating learning more about how HRV differs from heart rate monitoring, and the insights that we can learn from it all as well, what we can discover about our recovery, about our performance. And this is something that's happening as well. I would imagine this is something that's happening more and more. Simon, you probably have a comment on that. This isn't just kind of poodling along. I imagine this is kind of on the increase at the moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If we look at our own database, we've probably got close to 1.6, 1.7 billion data points now on UK PLC. We've probably got about 20,000 people measured, 20,000 days of data. So I really agree with your comment. People like data. I think we are coming to a point, though, that people like data plus action, because data in isolation doesn't help anyone. Data plus coaching, teaching creates a response.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, once again, Simon, thanks very much, and for taking time out of your day. I imagine you're busy down there in Lord's. enjoying the mugginess of the cupboard that you're in at the moment.
Yeah, out of the cupboard now.
I know you weren't expecting to actually show your background today, so I'm going to put you on the spot 5 minutes before we came on air. So thanks for that. Thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing all that information. And well, I'll look forward to hearing what the response is to this as well.
Thanks, George.
Brilliant. Bye for now.
Bye now.